What's up everyone, welcome back to the garage. This is episode 9 of the Scout rebuild and we're really just getting started. So even though it's been a while since I posted episode 8, let's jump right back in. So of course we're going to be starting with the frame, and there is some surface rust to deal with, but then we're going to be sanding and priming and getting everything ready for paint. But first I'm going to run through all of the tools and materials that I used to prep the frame. Then I'm going to do a quick summary of all the steps that I took to get the frame to this stage. Then I'm going to switch over to the swing arm and do a slightly more in-depth look at the process for those who like more detailed videos. Let's get started.
So real quick, here are the things that I used on the frame to prepare it for primer. A couple different grades of sandpaper. I got some 320 and some 600. This is wet dry sandpaper. Orbital sander. And I used some 240 grit on there. Small pneumatic belt sander, some Scotch-Brite. And these things here did the bulk of the work. So pneumatic die grinder with a couple different kinds of wire wheels, cone. And then this here, which is a Velcro backed Scotch-Brite disc, fits in the die grinder, and that is it.
So let's have a closer look at the frame, and more specifically the part of the frame where the rust looks the worst. So looking a little bit closer here gives you a better idea how bad the rust is in this spot. So I'm going to hit it with the wire wheel and then we'll get a better sense of exactly what we're dealing with. So the smaller, more aggressive wire wheel did the trick. It's like the Jack Russell of wire wheels. I took the frame outside to finish removing the rest of the rust. It was just making way too much dust to do inside the shop. So using all of the tools that I showed you in the beginning of the video, I proceeded to just go through all the spots of rust one by one and just get them to that state and just try to smooth everything out as best as I could without removing too much material. Even though it looks like all the rust is off, it's not. So what we want to do is chemically treat all the areas that had rust spots on them, just to add one more thing in there that will hopefully make it so that the rust doesn't come back. So one of the things that you can use to chemically treat rust is phosphoric acid. And this here is called Rust Mort. Its main ingredient is phosphoric acid. So I'll put a link to it down in the description. All I do is I use a small foam brush applicator that fits through the neck of the bottle. That way then I can just dab the phosphoric acid on in the spots where the rust is. And it's a little bit more controlled that way. I don't want to paint this over the entire frame. I'm just spot applying this the best that I can. So I let the rust mort sit overnight, and once it had done its thing, I got a pail of warm water and a rag and I just wiped down the entire frame. Then just to be sure, I took it outside and I washed the whole thing down with the garden hose, let it dry, and then it was time to start getting it ready for primer. So the next couple of steps, the details will be determined by what kind of primer that you're using, and I'll just tell you what I did in my circumstance. Because I had so much bare metal on the frame, I wanted to first use a etching primer to make sure that I had good adhesion onto the steel. So the etching primer that I chose to use said that I could prep the surface with a medium grade sandpaper and that it could be either wet or dry. So I used 320 wet. Once that step was done, I hit the frame with the etching primer, really focusing on the areas where there was bare metal. Then I did another wet sanding of that primer. For the second coat of primer, I just used like a high build primer from the same company. I'm not really sure how nicely those two primers are going to play together. I'm hoping, since they were the same brand, that it should be fine. So I guess we'll see on that. But there was still the odd spot where there was some slight unevenness in the surface. The high fill primer took care of that. So we're going to walk through the process again, but this time with a little bit more detail, and we're going to focus on the swing arm. For starters, I want to make sure that I get all of the grease and dirt off the swing arm. So once I removed the last remaining parts, I got to work. So what I'm using is a small brass brush, a small piece of fine Scotch-Brite, and just some general purpose degreaser. I did have the swing arm soaking in a Varsol tank, but it's still far from clean. So now I'm switching over to the die grinder, and I've got the smaller diameter, more aggressive wire wheel on there. Anywhere I see that there's rust, I'm removing everything down to bare metal. There's always those tricky spots to get at with the wire wheel, but we just do our best. And keep in mind, I mean, this is the swing arm, so it's going to take a beating. Now I'm switching over to the Scotch-Brite disc. The idea behind this is to finish removing all of the exposed rust and to feather out the areas where the paint's been removed. So I'd consider these discs aggressive, but not aggressive like a sanding disc on a grinder or even coarse sandpaper on a orbital sander. I don't want to remove any more material than I have to. The etching primer I'm using says to prep the area using 320 grit sandpaper. I'm going to use the sandpaper dry this time, and I'm just going to sand lightly by hand. All I'm trying to do is just kind of feather out the areas between where there's still paint and the bare metal. So now that the sanding's done, it's time to clean it up. I go over the whole swing arm fully 2 times with the wax and grease remover. Rust treatment time. So just like we did with the frame, I'm going to soak up a little bit of the chemical with that foam brush and then try to spot apply it in all the areas where there's bare metal, and especially areas where I know that there was rust. The rust converter has been on the swing arm for a little over a day now. So let's have a closer look. It's turned all of the rust black and formed crystals on the surface of the swing arm. It's also bubbled the remaining paint in a couple of spots. It's time to wash everything off with some water, and then there's going to be a little bit more cleanup to do. Some areas where the chemical is dried leave a chalky finish on the surface that can affect the paint if you don't get rid of it. So here I'm just going at it with the brass brush. Upon closer inspection, I decided to give the swing arm one more round of sanding. This time we're going to wet sand just to improve the finish a little bit. I noticed a couple of spots that could use a little bit more work. At this point I felt that if I just take the overall surface quality up just one more notch, that coupled with the filling primer that I was going to use for the second coat was going to get me the finish that I was looking for. That spot right there that you could see me pointing at, that is the really bad spot that I wanted to give some extra attention. You could really see the scratches in the paint there, and I didn't want to trust that the primer was going to fill those up. So we're finally ready to get primer on the swing arm. I've cleaned it 2 more times with the wax and grease remover. So it's the usual 2 light coats followed by a heavy coat, not spaced too far apart. The smart thing to do would have been to hang this part for painting. Also, since there was so many small spots of rust on the swing arm, I decided to just coat the whole thing with the etching primer. The etching primer turned out pretty good, and what I'm going to do now is give it one more round of wet sanding before we put the final coat of primer on. Same procedure as before. The only difference this time now is that I'm trying my best to not sand through the primer anywhere. I'm being especially careful along edge transitions. I'm giving it a quick wipe down with some paper towel and water, and then I'm going to switch over to the wax and grease remover again and give it 2 more rounds of that. Next, it was onto the filler primer. Once again, I gave the entire part a light dusting of paint followed by a wet coat. So there we have it, the second coat of primer dried. This is how any of the primered parts for the bike are going to be until I figure out exactly what my approach is going to be for final paint. I feel confident that I should be able to leave it like this and still finish the few small things that need to be done until it's time to paint it up. That's all for this one. Thanks for checking out this long overdue episode.